All right, hello everybody. Welcome to kind of our final lesson here on the World War II era. We're going to take a look at some of the things going on the home front. I know we've looked at some things in the past about Americans mobilizing, what the government's doing. We're going to look at some more things today about how World War II impacted Americans and how it especially impacted different groups at home. Objectives and standards to analyze how World War II caused a population shift, examine the efforts of war on Americans, explain the racial struggle that took place during the war, and analyze the decision to place Japanese Americans in internment camps. And take a moment here to read over the standards, please. Desired result, what was life like for Americans during the war? So bringing back jobs. As the war industry boomed, unemployment's going to fall. We also see incomes of Americans are going to rise, and Americans were able to save their money, and they also began to invest in war bonds as well, which we've discussed already. Fantastic farming. So farmers and their farms are also very successful. So we've talked about victory gardens, but farmers growing crops for the American public and for soldiers are also going to be successful. Good weather is going to allow for better crops. Farmers are also going to benefit from new technologies, and farmers are going to see their incomes rise as crop prices increase as well. And all these things, the rise in income during the war and rise of income of different people like farmers and things like that, are going to help lead to a very successful economy following World War II. So women at work, we've talked a lot about how over 6 million women entered the workforce during the war. Most women worked in the war industries, which had better pay and challenged them typically, but some women also worked as journalists or other professions while men were at war. And Americans are going to be on the move during the war. While the economy was growing and spreading, the population was also changing. So Americans began to move to different areas for work. Towns with defense industries saw their populations boom as well. I know my local hometown had a location for a military base and military training, and saw a lot of people move to the town during the war. Prior to that, it had been kind of like a quiet little farming town, but during the war, people moved in the area, and we see the rise of those areas. And African Americans are also going to leave the South for northern cities in huge numbers as well. But there's going to be some social struggles with these moves. So despite the booming economy, Americans are going to face other difficulties. Women are going to struggle with raising their children while their husbands were all fighting the war and maybe even balancing a job at the same time. Children were sometimes left to the care of neighbors or child care centers while their mothers worked. Teenagers who were sometimes left home alone could become in trouble with the law. And men returning from war had a hard time readjusting to society as well, just like the veterans of World War I or even veterans today sometimes. War can obviously have a not even so much a physical impact on people, but a mental impact on people as well. We're going to see the war bring about some new weddings. So the war helps spur new weddings and new families. A lot of times couples will rush to get married before the war would ship them overseas. But eventually, in the post-World War, new marriages will lead to what will become known as the baby boom. And we'll talk about that later on as well. So helping veterans, the government also took action to support veterans coming home. In 1944, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or known as the GI Bill of Rights, and it will provide education and training services to veterans to help them readjust to society. It also provided federal loans to help with veterans buying a home, farms, or even opening their own business as well. And over 7.8 million veterans are going to use some type of service of the GI Bill. Now, the fight for civil rights. Even though many African Americans moved out of the South due to discrimination, they continued to face discrimination in the North. James Farmer, that gentleman's picture right there, established the organization known as the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. Now, the interracial group fought for civil rights, And one of the first things they did was they set up the first sit-in at a segregated restaurant, meaning African Americans would go to these segregated restaurants where they weren't allowed to eat or sit, and they would sit at the counter. And sometimes whites would join them as well, and refuse to move from them until they were served. We'll talk more about that when we get to the civil rights period, about the effectiveness of sit-ins and things like that. But this was during World War II is when the first sit-in took place. Now, there was going to be some racial riots as well. In 1943, there were many riots across the country due to race. In June, there was a violent riot in Detroit where whites and African Americans got into a fight, and it soon spread across the city. The violence lasted for 3 days, and President Roosevelt will actually be forced to send federal troops to the area to resolve the issue. And by the end of it, 9 whites and 25 blacks were dead or dying as a result of this race riot. The Zoot riot. So African Americans soon realized they needed more support. By 1945, over 400 committees were established to support race relations across the country. And African Americans will not be the only ones who are going to face violence and discrimination, because Mexican Americans are going to face discrimination and violence as well. The Zoot riots occurred in Los Angeles, California in 1943 as well. They were called the Zoot riots because the Zoot suits were a fashion worn by young Mexican Americans as a symbol of rebellion against their traditional clothing and fashion styles. White sailors stated that they were attacked by Mexican Americans in Zoot suits, and the riots took place across the city for about a week. And many Mexican Americans, not even just those in Zoot suits, were beaten and violently attacked as well. Excuse me. So the internment of Japanese Americans. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Americans were suspicious of Japanese Americans. They felt that maybe Japanese were spies or planning another attack. And most Japanese Americans lived in Hawaii or along the western coast of the United States. So to kind of deter Japanese Americans, or to, in reaction to this fear, in 1942, the War Department ordered the removal of all Japanese Americans from Hawaii. And then President Roosevelt also issued an order calling for the removal of Japanese Americans from California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona as well. So some 110,000 Japanese Americans were gathered up and sent to 10 internment camps across the country. In this picture here, you'll see an example of what these internment camps looked like. Kind of like big barracks, and these Japanese Americans lived in these homes and were guarded. There were barbed wire and guards around these areas. And then here is a map showing you where some of the internment camps were. So again, they were moved away from the coast or coastal regions, as you can see, and put in the middle of the country. So, according to the government and other Americans, they couldn't try to plan another attack. But Japanese Americans are going to fight back against this. Now, there were never any charges filed against Japanese Americans for the things they were accused of possibly spying or helping maybe plan another attack. So in 1944, Fred Komatsu, that gentleman right there, took the case against the internment of Japanese Americans to the Supreme Court. So this case was known as Komatsu versus the United States. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled that the government had the authority to remove certain people for the protection of the United States. But Japanese Americans are not going to be done fighting for the treatment that they felt they deserved. And actually, later on in his life, Fred Komatsu will be given the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his actions to protect Japanese American rights. So, justice for Japanese Americans. After the war, the Japanese American Citizens League, or the JACL, formed to fight for compensation for those who were placed in internment camps for their homes, for their businesses, and other valuables. People lost their homes, people lost their businesses, they had to move suddenly and maybe didn't have their items anymore, their personal items. Now, it's going to take many years and hard fighting, but many Japanese Americans will receive payment for their losses, and again, many, many years later, the government will eventually apologize as well for the treatment of Japanese Americans during the war. All right, so think about some of the things we discussed. What was life like for Americans during the war? Think about some of the struggles they were going through, some of the positives they were facing, and think about some of the discrimination that's happening in our country as well during the war, not just in the military, but here at home too, against African Americans, Mexican Americans, and also Japanese Americans as well. All right, so I hope you have a good day or evening. Please try your best on the questions. Remember to respond to all of them with your best efforts, and I will hopefully talk to you guys later on.